My name is Patrick J. McGinnis, and I coined the term FOMO. That's short for fear of missing out, and it's why some people end up following the crowd. But we're not like them. We're part of a new species that isn't afraid to do things differently. I call us FOMO Sapiens. And this is the show where you'll meet people like us, phenomenal FOMO Sapiens, to learn how they find the courage and the ideas to live exceptional lives.
FOMO. FOMO. FOMO.
Welcome to another episode of FOMO Sapiens, the show for people who don't just follow the crowd, but instead take their own path to success in business and in life. I'm your host, Patrick J. McGinnis, venture capitalist by day, author and podcaster by night, and FOMO Sapiens 24/7. And since we're coming up on the end of the year, and it's a good time to start reflecting on the lessons learned, today we are going to focus on failure. That's right, failure, the other F word. And my guest today has seen lots of failure, and he has analyzed it and gives us tips on how not to fail when building something. My guest is Tom Eisenmann, who is the Howard H. Stevenson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School and the faculty co-chair of the Arthur Rock Center for Entrepreneurship. Now, that is a big deal because the Rock Center for Entrepreneurship is kind of like the nerve center of entrepreneurship at HBS. Since joining the faculty in 1997, he has led the Entrepreneurial Manager, an introductory course taught to all first-year MBAs. I took that class. I think I got an okay grade in it. He has launched 14 electives on all aspects of entrepreneurship, and he has authored more than 100 case studies. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, and he has taught many entrepreneurs that have gone on to become household names. So he is a very knowledgeable guy, and his new book, Why Startups Fail, catalogs what he has learned in this prodigious career about why companies fail, where entrepreneurs go wrong, and what we can learn from them so that we don't do it ourselves. And on this episode, you're going to learn exactly that. What are the patterns? What are the things that are, unfortunately, are repeated over and over again? We're going to hear about stories of how these things happen, and then we're going to learn how to avoid these failures. So if you're thinking about doing something new in 2022, whether it's starting business or starting a social enterprise or just trying to do something new, thinking about why companies fail can apply to all of that too. Now, my small ask for you this week relates to this because my whole philosophy, which I wrote about in my first book, The 10% Entrepreneur, is that going in full time is risky. And if you start part-time, you can actually mitigate risk by starting small and then scaling up from there. So I am a big believer in the fact that one way to avoid failure is to engage with entrepreneurship flexibly. So go check out that book if you're interested in it, or you can check out an audio course that I put together for Himalaya.com. It's called How to Be a Part-Time Entrepreneur. And it's basically like a podcast in 10 lessons where you can learn all about this. So go check it out. And if you're interested in learning more, you can also check out patrickmcginnis.com, where I have tons of free resources on part-time entrepreneurship. All right. So I'm going to mix it up this week. Yes, I know I always start with the same question, but I just want to try something new because Tom is a person who has taught a lot of very interesting people over the years. And so I started out our conversation by asking him this question. You've taught many students over the years. I'm sure some that have gone on to great fame and others that have gone into some relative infamy. So I'd love to just hear a couple of the people that you've taught over the years that might be familiar to the listeners.
Wow. I actually, Patrick, went back. I had to go back. You were class of 2004 at Harvard Business School. And I had to go figure out, I had thousands of students, so you can't remember all their names. So I had to figure out whether you were my student and went back and looked at the students I taught that year. You weren't among them. Shame on you. But one was who stands out. And I don't know if the listeners may remember the company, but wow, Joseph Park was in your class at Harvard Business School. Joseph, for the listeners, was the founder and CEO of a business called Cosmo, which probably epitomized the dot-com boom like nothing else I can think of. Cosmo was a bunch of people on bicycles delivering Mars bars and video cassettes when that was still a thing all around first New York City and then the world. Raised $250 million, including money from Amazon, and stepped on the gas, Joseph had been a business analyst at Goldman Sachs, I think, or some Wall Street thing. Had this idea, and back in those days, you could raise $250 million with an idea. And the thing I best remember about him is there was this fascinating set of profiles in Vanity Fair of the young entrepreneurs. The dot-com barons, and he was among them, sort of glitzy full-page picture of him, and a quote from him so they pulled out the quote in sort of big letters, and he's saying, so in the quote, this is almost verbatim, "Look, what's the worst thing that can happen? Is I lose $250 million of other people's money, and then I go to business school and I have incredible stories to tell."
Wow.
This is 2000, probably the year 2000, this article. And sure enough, he lost $250 million. The thing went bust, tried to grow too fast, and you can imagine there's not much of a business model, sort of bicycling Mars bars around town. Even though many businesses today are sort of making it work with exactly the same formula. And sure enough, 4 years later, Joseph shows up in my class, and there he is in the flesh, this entrepreneur who promised the worst thing that could happen is he'd end up at Harvard Business School. And he was an astonishing entrepreneur. This was a point when a lot of new technologies were coming on stream. Wi-Fi was relatively new, and voice over IP, sort of how a lot of us talk on the phone these days, was brand new. So we were working through all these technologies, and he was like a jazz musician. We'd cover something in class one day, and then we'd cover another technology the next day. And Joseph would come back 3 days later, and he'd have combined the two. So the concept he had was, okay, you've taught me about Wi-Fi, and that's going to be all over college campuses. And you've taught me about voice over IP, and it works over Wi-Fi. I'm going to launch a business for colleges. So, a huge money drain for families is like buying their kid a telephone from the universities. Used to make a lot of money by selling telephone service to graduates. They don't anymore because now everybody uses their cell phone. And so he conceived this whole thing and had a whole plan. And then, of course, you could hang all sorts of goods and services off of that once you had your hooks in them with phone service. He was an astonishing entrepreneur. Went on to, after business school, to launch Amazon at a point had a question and answer service, like Yahoo Answers. And Joseph built that business. I've lost track of him. I don't know what he's doing now.
Well, according to LinkedIn, he works at Samsung. So, hey, Joe, please call Professor Eisenmann and say hello. And the thing I'll tell you about Joe, so I didn't know him because I was like easily intimidated at the point in my life. So I was like too shy, but I knew his business because number one, I used to order from it all the time because they would like sell things really cheap and deliver them in an hour. So like as an investment banking analyst, or I guess I was at my VC career at that point, but like I would order stuff all the time from them and another company called Urban Fetch that would bring you cookies. And then the other thing is our firm had invested in Cosmo actually. And so I remember the meetings when the company was burning through this money and things were getting ugly and it was crazy. And there was one junior analyst who I will not name names, but who has gone on to become quite well known as an entrepreneur, who stood up to the partners and like questioned why they were doing this deal. And people just were like freaking out because they were like, how could you question these partners? She was 100% right. So good job, you. But I still have a Cosmo glass actually that I gave to somebody who I will mention in a little bit. I gave it to somebody who's going to come up later in the interview. So I should have sold it on eBay, or given it to Joe.
You should have saved it. So for the listeners who are fascinated by the character, and Joseph was a character, he's again an amazing entrepreneur, and the story. There's a documentary that was done around. I think it's called Startup.
Yes,
and I'm sure you can find it on Netflix, and it's riveting because it does tell the rise and fall story and gives a feel for those days were like. We're pretty frothy right now.
Yeah.
But boy, it was an unbelievable time.
It really was. And there's another one called startup.com, which is incredible. So go watch those guys, everybody. Now, so Tom, your book is called Why Startups Fail. And it's really good. And I love it because right now we are in this bubbly time where it's like, you feel like you can't fail other than like the spectacular, like WeWorkian type failures, which are so... It's like real. I mean, I called it "We Don't Work" because I was always like, I was a member and I was like, people aren't working. How can this be a good business? But you write about these 6 sort of like problems that can tank a startup in the book. And so what I wanted to do today is, we have a lot of people listening who are entrepreneurs or want to start companies. Just get into some of those so that folks who are listening when they start their company or as they build their companies don't fall in their trap. So let's start with the first one you talk about in the book. And that one is called Bad Bedfellows. What is that all? What's that all about?
Bad Bedfellows. Strange Bedfellows comes from Melville from Moby Dick.
Right.
For the English majors out there. So this is the idea. The entrepreneurs have got it's good idea, bad bedfellows. And it's a tragic situation where the entrepreneurs have got a really good idea and they just can't pull the team, and I mean capital T team, the founders, the rest of the team members, the investors, and entrepreneurs will often have partners, right? Because they're starting with nothing. So somebody else can help with the marketing or supply key technologies. And in this case, despite having a good idea, they can never quite pull together the set of, call them resource providers. They have to either provide money or time or something, their marketing channels. And as a result, the business never works. Yeah, that's and the example. Each of the failure patterns in the book is built around a case study. At Harvard Business School, we do everything around case method, and that's the approach I pulled into the book. So the case for Bad Bedfellows is an apparel company, Quincy Apparel, that had a great idea, real demand for the product, but just couldn't get the team together in enough time before the money ran out.
Now, would this also relate to the idea? There's a book that I'm sure you've read. It's written by one of your colleagues called "The Founder's Dilemmas," and it's like I remember there was a story from the book that the company didn't fail, but it really blew my mind. Which is the founders of Zipcar. They had a handshake deal to split the equity 50-50. And then one of them kind of never did all that much and the other did everything. And when they went public, they each owned half. And it's like getting things right, setting things up in a thoughtful way early on. If you don't do that, you can end up with bad situations. So is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Patrick, I love that story. We have a video. Robin Chase was the founder and CEO of Zipcar, and she made the biggest of big rookie mistakes in creating the company. She didn't have a founder's agreement. They agreed 50-50 to split the equity, exactly as you say. But normally a founder's agreement would have the equity vest. You don't really own it until some period of time has elapsed, over a period of time, often 3 or 4 years. Uh-huh. And so in this case, the co-founder, as you'll remember from the story, never quit her day job, really didn't contribute much to the venture. Robin was doing all the work and was CEO. So a CEO had the ability to fire her co-founder, but the co-founder retained the 50% of equity. If she'd left after a year, she would have not, 3/4 of her equity would have been unvested and would have been basically recovered back to Robin. And we have video of it now. We still use the case 20 years later, and we have video of Robin explaining this, and you can feel the anger and heartbreak, to give away so much wealth over something as simple as not having a proper contract. So for all the entrepreneurs out there, if you're at the beginning stages, the most important thing you do is have a founder contract, and that founder agreement needs to basically specify who owns what percentage and at what rate that equity is going to vest. And it also needs divorce provisions, right? Because founding teams, and Noam Wasserman is the former colleague that you mentioned, and he shows that founding teams are not stable. They break up. There's a lot of conflict, and this is indeed a big part of Bad Bedfellows. The company in question, Quincy Apparel, two best friends coming out of business school, like so many MBAs, wanted to be the boss. Both shared the CEO, and that can work, but really, when you both want to be the boss, you're going to have different views. In this case, they had different views about what the apparel should look like, which is pretty fundamental to a fashion company. And that slowed them down. And you can't, as an entrepreneur, afford to be slow. So So yeah, you got to sort out responsibilities. You got to sort out ownership. You got to sort out, if you don't agree over this stuff, how are you going to split? Can you both take the company, all the intellectual property and all the work? Can you each go start your own version? Who gets to own the thing if you split up?
Yeah, and listeners, if you want to hear more on that topic, this is super important. We had on the founders of Primary, Galen and Christina, who are co-CEOs, and they talk about how they have divided the responsibilities in the business and what they've been able to do in that front. So it's an episode for a couple of years back. Go find it in the old the backlog and check it out. Now you have another. The second one, the second sort of mistake you talk about here is called false starts. So what's that all about?
Yeah, that's the big one. I would say of all the 6 patterns you mentioned, 3 of them are early stage. Mm-hmm. So ventures that are just getting going, are still searching for a market, assembling all the resources. And this is probably the biggest killer of early stage startups. And the problem here is just like in track and field or swimming, where the athlete will jump out of the blocks trying to get an edge, but goes too early and suffers a penalty as a result. Here, the entrepreneur, so eager to build and sell the thing with a burning conviction that they've got the next best, greatest thing, just starts the engineering work and gets the product to market as fast as they can. By the way, all this behavior, if your readers, if you talk with your listeners, about lean startup, this is consistent with a lot of the rhetoric of lean startup, fail fast, and just do it mentality. And it reinforces every bone in an entrepreneur's body, the bias for action, right? Entrepreneurs are people that make things happen. And what they've done is they've skipped a stage of upfront research that should happen in every venture before you launch the venture, where you're really familiarizing yourself with the customer and their problems. Have you really, really found a strong unmet need? And have you explored all the solutions to those unmet needs? Too quickly, these entrepreneurs latch onto a problem and a solution, and they go as fast as they can. And it might work. Sometimes it works. Those are lucky entrepreneurs. But too often, the first version of the product, if you haven't done this upfront work, misses the mark. You spend 4 months on a failed version of the product. You'll pivot away. Good entrepreneurs will pivot. They'll take the feedback and move. But if you've raised 12 months worth of capital, or 18 months, pick a number, and you waste the first 4 months on a flawed version of the product that actually, if you just spent, we're not talking about a year here. This is 3 weeks of work, maybe 2 months. And you're basically exchanging 4 weeks of upfront work for 4 months wasted. And that's a pretty good trade for an entrepreneur who's on borrowed time.
It reminds me, I'm having like pangs in my heart right now because I invested in a company. It was a retail startup in Turkey. If anybody's in Turkey, you might remember it's called For You. And we were trying to do like a hard discount drugstore. And so I remember we put a lot of money. I think the company raised like $50 million. And we were like opening like 9 stores a week. It was crazy town. And I remember it was going badly. And so I went to one of our stores in Istanbul and I stood outside. And I watched as customers walked by, looked in the window, looked confused, and then kept on walking because we'd never figured out. And it was a failure. Like, by the way, it went bankrupt and it was a disaster. And so, it's like, and I remember I was talking to a buddy of mine from business school who had invested in a bunch of retail, like, Albapan. He's like, well, did you talk to customers? And I was like, I think we probably could have done a little bit more of that. So get out into the world, leave the confines of the office and meet with the people in the street, and you will avoid this kind of problem. Now, we're going to skip over false promises and move on to number 4, which is speed traps, because you have this is like my favorite chapter in the book, because you talk about a company that I kind of know and was there for a little bit as an observer, and it's fab.com. So talk about speed traps and tell a little bit of the story of fab.com.
Sure. Fab. So speed trap is just what it sounds like. This is now a later stage startup pattern for the listeners. By later stage, we mean you've got a product that you've sort of demonstrated that you can sell something to people. You've assembled a team, you've raised some money, and the shocking thing is, you'd think you were out of the woods, but if the measure of failure is didn't make money for investors, which is one way to measure failure, then it's still the case that about 1 in 3 of late stage startups fail to get a positive return to the investors, which is pretty bad. and Fab was one of them. Raised $300 million and lost almost everything. Sort of sold for about $30 million at the end. And Fab was an online retailer of home furnishings. So look around you, the stuff you see, the stuff on the table itself, the stuff on the table, the pillows, all that jazz. And there were some notable failures in that sector. They weren't the only one. And the way the speed trap plays out, and it certainly did at Fab. I think they're the poster venture for this is you get off to a great early start. And at Fab, they had Brandon Shellhammer was the co-founder who had brilliant, quirky design taste and knew how to find products that people who were into that would say, I got to have that. I have to have that chandelier made out of martini glasses. I have to have a rhinestone encrusted motorcycle helmet. And so he would find these things, not literally one of a kind, but very, very unusual. And they created a flash sale business around that. And it took off. The word spread like wildfire through social media. People came back and bought again and again and passed on word to their friends. And so had a tremendous launch. And Jason Goldberg, who's the CEO and co-founder, brilliant at managing the social media around all of this. Investors poured in. This is part of the speed trap. So at a very high price for the equity, expecting continued growth, hyper growth. And entrepreneurs are happy to oblige. Like, what entrepreneur doesn't want to grow? That's sort of the point. It's how many people keep score. And so the next wave of growth in a lot of businesses isn't as easy to get as it is with the early adopters. The early adopters find you and they spread word about you. The next wave isn't as interested in rhinestone encrusted motorcycle helmets. And to get their attention, you have to do paid marketing, paid advertising. And they don't come back and repurchase. They don't spread word of mouth. You probably have to discount more to get them to buy. So you're getting this squeeze between how much a customer brings you, the price you charge them and the revenue they bring, and the cost of acquiring them. And this very much happened at Fab pretty quickly. Insult to injury with Fab. They were quickly cloned in Europe, as happens with a lot of businesses. There's an outfit there called Rocket Internet, and they had already made a brilliant set of moves, copying companies like Groupon and Pinterest. These are sort of early 2000s, mid 2000s, and the Birchbox they cloned, and the drill was. Buy our clone, or basically we'll conquer Europe, and if you come here, you'll face trench warfare. So you don't want to do that. So just buy us, and then we'll reap a big happy return. Fab said, that's a horrible thing. Great design. You can't possibly do this. We're great. We understand great design, and our designers will back us. So they poured into Europe and spent like $150 million building a giant business in Berlin, and learned that European tastes were different than U.S. tastes, and that the complexities of doing e-commerce across a whole bunch of European countries was expensive, and they were facing trench warfare with the players there. So that was a mess. Meanwhile, the U.S. business, because it's maturing and it's facing these customers who aren't as interested, is just burning through cash. So cash is flying out the door. But Jason Goldberg, who's a dazzling, charismatic salesman, like so many great entrepreneurs, is able, just based on the strength of the growth, they're still growing, to raise a couple more rounds. He has a quote in a postmortem of the business where I know I'm not allowed to swear on the podcast, so I will abbreviate it.
Okay.
But he's raised money at a unicorn valuation, $1 billion valuation, but it's only about half or a third of what he needed to fulfill his plan, which was burning up through all his capital. He says, here I'm getting all these congratulations. Not too many people know what it's like to raise money at a $1 billion valuation and know that you're headed straight into an S storm. And they were. And other things happen in speed trap companies. If you got humans in your business, which some software businesses are fortunate to not have, but if people are answering phones and answering emails and packing stuff in a warehouse, then you got to recruit all those people. You need systems in place which don't exist in the original startup, right? All this stuff has to be put in place. The systems, the processes for coordinating everybody's work. And you get a cultural mess too, often in these speed trap companies where you get old guard, new guard. People who are present at the creation, know the founder, believe in its mission, compared to all these specialists, some of whom this is just a job. Others think their contributions aren't understood or appreciated. You get fiefdoms. The warehouse people have a different subculture than the marketing people. The marketing people blame the engineering people for being late on features, and so the culture tends to go bad. And sometimes it didn't happen at Fab, but you get slippery slope behavior. This is Zenefits, if anybody's familiar with that story, or Theranos for sure. So people go over an ethical line just to sustain the growth. Ubiome was a great example of that. Eventually, you need to raise more money, and the new investors look at this and say, "Whoa." So you go back to your existing investors and say, "We need a bridge. We need more funding," and they say, "It's just
sorry."
It's unclear whether you're ever going to get there, and the whole thing can unravel remarkably fast once the money stops coming in.
FOMO.
And that's what happened to Fab.
FOMO.
Yeah, so I love this story, and I sent this story to, and those of you who have been longtime listeners know Beth Ferreira. She's been on the show twice. She was the COO of Fab, and we talked about it in the previous interview, and I kind of teased her a little bit because I remember when she worked there, going to their office, and it was like, it's actually where Venmo is now, actually, in New York City.
Wow.
It's the office of Venmo, it was this beautiful office in the West Village, and I would see Bradley around the neighborhood. He's a very, this guy, he wears like very interesting clothing. I think once I saw him wearing like a sailor suit, and she was always in Europe because she was dealing with that mess. And so I sent her, I was like taking pictures of the pages of Tom's books and sending them to her. And she wrote back to me. She said she felt the business was working in the US, but headed to Europe too soon, and that it chased growth to grow into a huge valuation. And it was a train wreck. So listen, she thought it was a great case study. So, I think it's great for anybody who wants to be an entrepreneur, who is thinking about working at a startup. Like you can only, I have a friend who joined WeWork like the week before it blew up. All of the things that Tom's talking about here, when you look at some of these large companies that it's like, oh, we just raised another $3 billion at this crazy valuation. If you get below the surface, a lot of these speed traps, you could see them. Now, Tom, you have over the years, obviously you've seen tons of companies, even really smart people who've seen a million companies fail and make bad investments. That's just entrepreneurship. But, if for our listeners who are maybe investing in companies or who, maybe are thinking about joining a company, like what are some like basic things that they should consider to make a smart decision about investing their time and money in a company?
Yeah, I think the mistakes I've made as an investor mirror some mistakes that entrepreneurs can make in building a business. The Bad Bedfellows company, Quincy Apparel, is a good example. I had invested in Rent the Runway, knew worked closely with the founders, loved them, loved the business. It's had its own pandemic issues, but it's basically, they built a company at a point with a $900 million valuation, and they didn't know anything about fashion, really. And so that gave me the confidence a year later to back another pair of Harvard Business School women who had a concept for building a fashion company, fashion tech. And it turns out that renting dresses and designing and selling dresses are two completely different businesses. In the latter, you really need domain expertise. Like it's this incredibly arcane process of coming up with a pattern and cutting the pattern and sourcing the fabric and quality control, all of these specialized functions that the Quincy founders didn't understand. They just didn't have the experience, and they hired people who could do it, but those people weren't right for working inside a startup where you sort of have to scramble from one thing to another. And it gave me a real appreciation for how wild it is that domain expertise is super crucial in some startups, but really not that important in others. I mean, I'm very close to the co-founders of Cloudflare, one of Harvard Business School's biggest successes.
Amazing company.
It went public last year. It has a $30 billion valuation. It does internet plumbing infrastructure, sort of speeds up the internet and makes it safer. And Matthew knew something about internet infrastructure, but they basically were able to build this great company without the deepest of domain expertise, but it killed the apparel company. So I'm much more tuned into that. And the other thing I've learned, entrepreneurs can get seduced by false positives. So just as in the sense of COVID, right? COVID testing, medical testing. Entrepreneurs are very vulnerable to false positives. You think you've got a good thing, but you don't. And false negatives, which it actually can cause you to throw in the towel too quickly. It's like it's not working. But maybe if you just tried some other things or persisted, it would. And the false positive happens, and it happens to a lot of entrepreneurs, because there's often a group of crazy, foaming at the mouth enthusiasts out there that will like your early product, your shoestring and bubblegum product. And you need them, of course. They're going to spread the word about your thing. These are the people that got Fab going. But if you focus too much on them, design the product or the service only for them, you may end up over-engineering. It's often the case the early adopters have more sophisticated, they're power users, more sophisticated requirements than the mainstream customers that you rely on to build a big business. So it can lead you to scale prematurely, as it did with Fab. It can lead you to design the wrong product. And everybody gets excited because you just love the momentum you've got with the early adopters. So the investors are, I think, just as likely to get excited about it as the entrepreneurs are. So I try to figure out if domain expertise is important, and I try to figure out if we've got a false positive when there's early signs of success.
Those are very, very good pieces of advice, everybody. I was taking notes. All right. The book is called Why Startups Fail. And I just learned out in the UK and Commonwealth countries, it's called The Fail-Safe Startup, or I guess it would be The Fail-Safe Startup. Tom Eisenmann, thanks so much for being here.
Patrick, it was a blast. Thanks so much.
Can't get enough of FOMO Sapiens? Join me on Patreon for ad-free episodes, bonus material, and exclusive content that will help you to master FOMO and position yourself for greater success in both business and life. Go to patreon.com/FOMO Sapiens to learn more. You can also connect with me on Instagram at Patrick J. McGinnis, on Twitter at PJ McGinnis, and on LinkedIn. I love hearing from you, so don't be shy. FOMO Sapiens is recorded in New York City. Theme music is by Mike McGinnis, and editing and post-production is by Josh Elstro. If you like today's show, please be sure to rate it and recommend it to your friends. And as always, you can find me at FOMOSapiens.com and at PatrickMcGinnis.com. To advertise on FOMO Sapiens, reach out to contact@FOMOSapiens.com.
FOMO.